Throughout heaven and earth, I alone am the honored one. This is one of the most iconic phrases in the entirety of Jujutsu Kaisen, and it is spoken by its most recognizable and popular character, Satoru Gojo. It precedes an amazing moment of hype when Gojo decides to turn Toji Fushiguro into the letter C by teaching him about colors. On the surface, this line is a moment of raw ego and emphasizes that Gojo has truly become untouchable. However, on a deeper level, the words that Gojo says here may actually give us a clue as to the story that Gege Akutami is trying to tell us with the entirety of Jujutsu Kaisen. What if I told you that Gojo's Honored One moment has ties to the lore of Buddhism and that almost all of JJK is a modern-day Buddhist allegory? When I first looked into the Buddhist references in JJK, I was expecting there to be just a few references, such as Gojo's line about being the Honored One or Geto's clothing when he turned evil. But the more I dug into it, the more I realized that the entire story is packed to the brim with Buddhist symbolism. Researching Buddhism really gave me a new perspective and appreciation for the story of JJK as a whole. To be honest, I felt like the ending of the manga felt very rushed, unsatisfying, and overall very frustrating to read. However, as I continued my research for this video, I came to appreciate all of the effort and little details that this manga took when implementing Buddhist symbolism and allegories into its story. Gege Akutami may have his flaws in terms of character development and pacing, but you can't deny that the author had a vision. I feel like to truly understand what Gege was trying to do with Jujutsu Kaisen, you first have to understand Buddhism. As with any religion, Buddhism has many different variations and interpretations. So, for simplicity's sake, I'll be using the most simplified and widely accepted Buddhist interpretations and pulling from specific Buddhist lore that I believe that Gege used for inspiration in writing JJK. I will also be mostly using the Japanese names for Buddhist figures and deities since we are talking about a story written by a Japanese author. So, to start off, what exactly is Buddhism? Buddhism is the fourth largest religion in the world and dates back to over 2,000 years ago. It originated in what is now India and spread by a figure known as Siddhartha Gautama, but most of you know him by another name, the Buddha. His title directly translates to the Awakened One, and it's fitting considering the teachings of this religion, which focuses on the elimination of suffering through a path of meditation and self-actualization. Siddhartha Gautama reached a level of inner peace that allowed him to truly understand the meaning of life and free himself from mortal suffering, achieving a state known as Enlightenment or Nirvana. Basically, he vibed so hard that he transcended human boundaries. Enlightenment is the end goal of Buddhism, and those who achieve this state are known as Buddhas or Bodhisattvas. The main difference between a Buddha and a Bodhisattva is that Buddhas fully transcend the mortal realm, and Bodhisattvas choose to remain here to help us normies reach enlightenment as well. In order to reach this transcendent state, one must truly understand a few key concepts of Buddhism, starting with the Four Noble Truths. These are often the first teachings of Buddhism. The Four Noble Truths refer to four crucial facts about life that Buddhists believe. The first of the Noble Truths, Duḥkha meaning suffering, states that suffering is an inherent and continuous part of everyday life. The second Noble Truth, Samudaya meaning origin or cause, states that suffering is the result of our humanly desires, clingings, and attachments. The third noble truth, Nirodha, meaning ending or confinement, states that suffering will end once you completely let go of your attachments and desires. The fourth and final noble truth, Marga, meaning road or path, states that you can achieve enlightenment and free yourself from suffering by following the Noble Eightfold Path. And just what is the Noble Eightfold Path, you ask? Well, it's essentially a summary of Buddhist practices to follow in order to reach the end goal of enlightenment. These 8 practices essentially boil down to being a chill, good person. The guidelines include what most people would consider tenets for being a good person, such as avoiding lying, not having harmful thoughts, and treating others with kindness and respect. and also like a lot of meditation. Like a lot. Once you follow the eightfold path to a T, bada bing bada boom, you're enlightened and you're ready to call yourself a Buddha and get a one-way trip to Nirvana, right? Well, if only it were that easy. You see, completely ridding yourself of your worldly desires and being completely 100% free from attachments is nearly impossible. Otherwise, there would be a lot more Buddhas and Bodhisattvas. So, unfortunately, most of the world is stuck in an endless loop of living a life full of suffering over and over again. Buddhists believe in the idea of reincarnation or being born again after the end of your life, and if you haven't attained enlightenment as a Buddha, you're stuck in this endless cycle of reincarnation into a world of suffering. This endless cycle of suffering and reincarnation is known as samsara, and this is where Jujutsu Kaisen comes in. I don't know about you, but a repeating cycle into a world of suffering sounds pretty on brand for Jujutsu Kaisen. The power system of JJK is known as cursed energy, and it is stated that every human on the planet has cursed energy to some extent, and those who are capable of controlling theirs become Jujutsu sorcerers. On the flip side, if enough cursed energy leaks out of humanity and takes a form, it becomes a cursed spirit, which is how we get Jogo, Mahito, Hanami, and this adorable little guy. Oh daggone, they could never make me hate you. Cursed energy is the core basis of Jujutsu Kaisen and reflects the first of the four noble truths of Buddhism, Duḥkha or suffering. Everyone in JJK has cursed energy stemming from the inherent suffering they experience in their lives, which drives the entirety of the plot. Cursed energy and the suffering that it brings binds people to an inherently miserable existence where they are vulnerable to attacks by cursed spirits. The Jujutsu sorcerers themselves don't fare any better since they don't exactly have the highest life expectancy without plot armor. And thus, the crux of JJK's plot is figuring out how to manage living in a world of continuous suffering, which aligns with the Buddhist goal of eliminating suffering through striving for enlightenment. So, what is the solution for this endless battle between sorcerers and curses, this eternal sorcery fight, this Jujutsu Kaisen? Enter Suguru Geto. Geto is a prime example of the Buddhist concept of dukkha since he describes his life as an endless cycle of exercising and consuming cursed spirits. He describes this process as being like eating a rag covered in Peter Griffin's regurgitated clam chowder. After a while of suffering, Geto comes to the realization that the best way to deal with cursed energy is to go full Eren Yeager. The way that he sees it, if it's only non-sorcerers that produce curses, then why not eliminate the problem at its source? Geto's turn to the dark side makes him into a perversion of Buddhist principles and teachings. He attains a twisted form of Buddhist enlightenment while his best friend obtains a more pure form of enlightenment. More on him later. Geto even wears the clothing of a Buddhist monk from the Heian era to further continue this illusion that he is a savior rather than a false prophet that he truly is. He grows so hateful and resentful that he even develops his own patented hater terminology, calling all non-curse users monkeys after hearing Toji refer to himself as a monkey. Even this little terminology ties back to Buddhism since Toji the monkey met his end at the hands of Gojo, JJK's allegory for the Buddha. This is meant to symbolize the legendary story Journey to the West in which the Monkey King Sun Wukong was defeated by the Buddha. Geto takes to calling every non-sorcerer a monkey to hammer home the fact that he wants to become a Buddha-like figure, but instead of enlightenment, he leads his followers towards ruin and destruction. Gege Akutami perfectly sums up Geto's character through Buddhist iconography using a single page. The cover page for chapter 70 is one of my favorite pages that Gege has ever drawn. Not only does it look really cool, but it is so rich with detail and Buddhist symbolism. Here, Geto is positioned as the Buddha or a Bodhisattva. This indicates how Geto develops a god complex after losing the Star Plasma Vessel, losing to Toji, losing his faith in humanity, and starting his own cult. Here, he is being prayed to by a congregation of cursed spirits. This has multiple meanings. Geto's power is to consume and manipulate curses to do his bidding, hence why the curses are worshipping him as a god. Another way that you can interpret this is that he is not on the side of humanity, but exclusively is on the side of curses and cursed energy users. The most interesting detail you have to pay attention to in this image are the positions of his hands. Geto's hand gestures are meant to mimic the hand poses that Buddhas and Bodhisattvas make, known as a mudra. Depictions of the Buddha would often show his right hand raised upward and his left hand lowered to symbolize protection, peace, and the dispelling of fear. You can clearly see on the chapter cover that Suguru Geto has his left hand upward and right hand downward. The inverse in hand gestures clues us in on the fact that Geto's teachings and actions only offer more fear and harm to the world. Again, it's incredible how much detail can be packed into a single image, and I'm sure there's so much more that can be said about this that I haven't already covered or found. And while we're on the subject of hand gestures, let's talk about arguably the sickest part of Jujutsu Kaisen, domain expansions. To understand these epic finishing moves and their Buddhist origins, we first have to understand something known as a mandala. Mandalas are meditation tools consisting of geometric diagrams that are usually drawn on paper, tablets, colored sands, and scrolls, and they are used to represent, essentially, the universe. These patterns serve as a sacred space that you can completely concentrate in. It can be described as a representation of an imaginary palace that you can enter during periods of intense meditation where you can visualize every single minute detail of the space. In other words, a mandala symbolizes a pocket universe that you can create and attain in your own mind through great effort and concentration. If you haven't guessed already, this is exactly how a domain expansion works. Every single domain is achieved by sorcerers with an immense concentration and understanding of themselves and their cursed energy. It gets even deeper since the hand gestures which Jujutsu sorcerers use to trigger their domains can also be traced back to Buddhist lore. As mentioned before, mudras are a sign that Buddhas and Bodhisattvas can make to symbolize certain concepts. Every single domain expansion in JJK is activated using a Buddhist mudra that perfectly represents the character as a whole. For example, Yuji Itadori's domain expansion hand sign is based off of the mudra of Jiso Bosatsu, a bodhisattva whose goal is to save the sentient beings of Earth and guide others towards enlightenment, specifically those who were condemned to hell. Chapter 265 even features prominent flowers in Buddhism. Yuji sees the flowers as morning glories, which in Buddhism are symbolic of enlightenment and wisdom, while Sukuna sees the same flowers as hydrangeas, which are used by Buddhists for cleansing rituals. This Buddhist symbolism in the flowers show us in one sentence that Yuji has become more knowledgeable about life and that Sukuna would soon be cleansed. Moving on to another domain expansion, Megumi Fushiguro's domain hand sign is based off of the mudra of Yakushi Nyorai, commonly known as the Medicine Buddha. This Buddhist figure has a specific vested interest in helping the sick and helping women, which ties to Megumi's main goal of helping his sick sister. What's most interesting about Yakushi Nyorai is that this deity has 12 monsters who protect him, known as the 12 Divine Generals. You can kind of see where I'm going here, since one of those generals is named Mahala, also known as Makora, or as he is most commonly referred to in JJK, the 8-handled sword divergent Sila Divine General Maharaga. Fun fact, his name is supposed to be Makora, but a lot of English speakers call him Maharaga due to the Viz translations, and the name kinda gets stuck, so people in the West have just been calling him the wrong name for years. And while we're on the subject of Maharaga, let's talk about the spinning wheel on his back. This is known as the Dharma Chakra, or the Wheel of Dharma, and it has been the key symbol of Buddhism, similar to the cross or the Star of David for Christianity or Judaism respectively. This wheel itself represents the cycle of samsara, which again is the cycle of life, suffering, and reincarnation in Buddhism. When this wheel gets turned, it signifies a great change and revolution in the world. This all explains why the Divine General is seemingly immortal and continues to adapt to any damage eternally. Bodhisattvas and Buddhas aren't the only ones with mudras, since Sukuna's hand signs for his domain comes from the mudra of Yama, the king of hell in Buddhism, which is an incredibly fitting piece of symbolism for the king of curses. Alright, I have spent way too much time talking about domain expansions, so I'm going to do a speed run of the remaining domains to keep this video from being an hour long. But let me know in the comments below if you want me to make a dedicated video on just domain expansions and their respective Buddhist symbolisms. Okay, speed run, go. Hikari's domain expansion is based on Benzaiten, a goddess of wealth and fortune, which again very fitting for his personality. Mahito's domain expansion combines two different deities. The first hand sign invokes the original Buddha Gautama himself, and the second invokes a female deity known as Kojaku Myu. This represents his androgynous form and how he was the only one of the cursed spirits to truly understand his own soul and achieve a form of enlightenment. Yuta's domain expansion invokes Dakini, which is a female goddess that consumed humans, which ties to how Rika eats cursed energy users to gain their techniques and give to Yuta. Kenjaku's domain trigger is a simple Buddhist meditation hand sign that doesn't represent a specific deity because he's not like other sorcerers, he's different like that. Again, there are so many different domains in JJK with so many specific meanings, so let me know if you want me to make a dedicated video on just domains. And before you type in the comments, I know I left out a very specific, very iconic, and very powerful domain belonging to a very specific, very iconic, and very powerful sorcerer in JJK. This is because I was saving him for last. For you see, this character is the final piece of the Buddhist puzzle of JJK. This is the character who ties everything together. The character whose story you'll see in a different lens once you analyze it from a Buddhist perspective. And this character, of course, is Panda. Just kidding, everyone knows that Panda is boundless and transcends even the enlightenment of the Buddha. Instead, we will have to talk about the second most important character in JJK, Satoru Gojo. It is very easy to label Satoru Gojo as JJK's version of the Buddha and just call it a day. Gojo is a walking, talking Buddhist reference. He is quite literally untouchable and stands at the top of the Jujutsu world as its most powerful and most enlightened being. His transcendence during the Hidden Inventory arc highlights him reaching enlightenment and attaining the status of a Buddha. He even says the same line that the original Buddha said upon his birth, "I alone am the honored one." Even his ability, the 6 eyes, are a reference to the 6 realms of samsara and the 6 transcendental powers of enlightened beings in Buddhism. However, these are all surface level details and references. I want to dive a whole lot deeper and answer the question, how does Gojo's story connect thematically to Buddhism, and what does it mean for the greater meaning of JJK as a whole? Well, for starters, while I do believe that Satoru Gojo represents a figure who attains Buddhahood, I don't believe that he achieved it in this scene, but rather he achieved it in this scene. Let me explain. As a reminder, a bodhisattva in Buddhism is a figure who achieves a form of enlightenment but has yet to truly ascend to becoming a Buddha. I believe that before his defeat by the hands of Sukuna, Gojo more closely represented a bodhisattva but obtains true Buddhahood once his life comes to an end. A key difference between a bodhisattva and a Buddha is that the Buddha is able to escape the cycle of life and rebirth, aka samsara, while a bodhisattva remains within the cycle until they reach true enlightenment, aka nirvana, aka not being born back into the cycle. In Buddhism, there are 2 stages of nirvana. The first stage is achieved during life, and the second stage is achieved after that life ends. I believe that when Gojo declared him to be the honored one against Sukuna, that was the moment he achieved the first stage of nirvana. And it wasn't until after his battle with Sukuna and at the end of his life that he finally achieved the second stage of nirvana and obtained true Buddhahood in that airport. Need more proof? Well, let's take some things into consideration, starting with his domain expansion. See, I told you I'd get there. Gojo's infinite void is triggered by a hand sign of Taishakuten, who is referred to as the ruler of the gods in Buddhist lore. This fits with Gojo's character, seeing as how he sits atop the Jujutsu world as the strongest sorcerer of the modern day. If Gojo were to have obtained full Buddhahood during the Hidden Inventory arc, then his hand sign for his domain expansion should have invoked one of the many hand signs of the Buddha rather than one of a simple Buddhist deity. This doesn't mean that Gojo hasn't become enlightened. As mentioned before, there are 2 stages of enlightenment, and Gojo reached the first stage when he met Toji. Remember those 4 noble truths and how they say that life is inherently full of suffering caused by a person's worldly desires, and only by shedding those desires can you achieve enlightenment? Well, during his Honored One moment, Gojo says that he doesn't feel anything other than peace and bliss, seemingly shedding himself from his desires. He even says that he doesn't feel any malice against the people who ended Amanai's life, namely Toji. Much like a bodhisattva, Gojo stays on Earth and teaches the next generation of Jujutsu sorcerers to help them eliminate curses, or in the Buddhist context that we discussed before, getting closer to enlightenment. He also spends the entirety of the main JJK story feeling completely lonely and isolated because his strength makes it impossible for anyone to understand him. Anyone, that is, until he meets Ryomen Sukuna. Sukuna is another important part of this puzzle since he is also someone who shed his mortal desires. Sukuna views himself as a living embodiment of destruction. Nothing matters in his existence other than facing and defeating the next big thing that stands in his way. In his own way, Sukuna has achieved some kind of enlightenment similar to Gojo. He has no desires, no need for love, no need for attachments. He simply exists, and his existence means destruction. When Gojo and Sukuna clashed, they were the only 2 beings alive who could understand the others, since the 2 of them were the only ones in existence who had reached that stage of nirvana. At least, the first stage of nirvana. I believe that the most thematically resonant moment of their battle comes towards the end when Gojo launches his final massive hollow purple at Makora, and we see in glorious detail his wheel of Dharma, the representation of samsara, the cycle of eternal suffering, completely shatter. Remember, nirvana has 2 stages, the first in life and the second after that life ends. Once you reach nirvana, you are completely free from the cycle of rebirth and reincarnation. You are no longer stuck in samsara and transcend the mortal realm free from suffering. Gojo's life was miserable, lonely, and quite full of suffering. After meeting Sukuna, he finally got what he wanted in his life. Someone who truly understood him. Someone who was the strongest. Gojo breaking the wheel of Dharma on Makora's back symbolized Gojo's escape from samsara. It symbolized his final enlightenment, and unfortunately for the rest of the world, this means that he could no longer stay on Earth. Gojo is sent off with the imagery of a lotus flower. These flowers represent the awakening of the Buddha, and it describes how Gojo feels reaching a state that no one else can ever reach. After the wheel finally breaks, Gojo was finally free from the suffering he felt for so long and was ready to board that airplane to nirvana. So, what does all of this Buddhist symbolism say about the story of JJK? Well, in my personal interpretation, Jujutsu Kaisen is Gege Akutami's way of retelling the 4 noble truths of Buddhism in the most kick-ass way possible. The world is full of suffering, hence the cursed energy that exists all around Jujutsu Kaisen. Suffering comes from desires and attachments, and those who shed them like Gojo and Sukuna are able to achieve enlightenment. Gojo takes up the role of first a bodhisattva and then a Buddha, being the first to ascend to true nirvana, while every other Jujutsu sorcerer is just following in his path, similar to the Eightfold Path in Buddhism to reach enlightenment. The primary heroes of our story like Yuji, Yuta, and Megumi can be seen as bodhisattvas themselves since they have awakened their cursed energy and are the closest in following Gojo's footsteps. Similar to bodhisattvas, they stay on Earth to help those affected by curses. Yuji and Megumi both even have domains that are based off of bodhisattvas and Buddhas themselves. The thing about bodhisattvas though is that they still remain within the cycle of samsara, and this is in line with the ending of JJK where Yuji, Megumi, and the rest of the gang return to their jobs as jujutsu sorcerers, continuing the status quo of exercising curses. Gojo has left the chat and ascended to Nirvana to become the Buddha, but Yuji and Megumi? They'll continue repeating the cycle over and over, enduring the suffering, eliminating curses, forever stuck in samsara, and forever stuck in their Jujutsu Kaisen. This is why Yuji and everyone in JJK go through so much suffering. Existence is full of suffering and you have to endure it to continue existing. Not everyone can be a Gojo and escape samsara. However, there is seemingly a silver lining in what Yuji tells Sukuna in his domain expansion. Yuji reaffirms to Sukuna that despite all of the suffering that people go through in this endless cycle, in this samsara, every person, regardless of who they are, have inherent value and their lives matter. I think that Gege wants us to lean towards Yuji's mentality that your life is meaningful and worth living despite how much suffering will inevitably come your way. But this is where you come in. As I mentioned at the beginning of this video, Buddhism is an extremely complex and expansive subject with so many interpretations and variations, and there is no way that I could possibly sum it up with a single video, much less catch all of the Buddhist references that Gege slipped into JJK. Let me know in the comments down below what other nods to Buddhism lore that you found in JJK that I haven't already mentioned. Also, feel free to let me know if I got anything wrong when it comes to Buddhism, as I am always open to more context on these complicated topics. And as always, don't forget to hit that like and subscribe button, and I'll catch you next time with some more lukewarm takes.